When you discuss the constitutionality of these measures, doesn't the federal government have the right to immigration because it is stated in the Constitution that they have the power over naturalization?
Well, unless you interpret naturalization as meaning everything pertaining to immigration, then no. As for the 10th Amendment, it is really the states that have the greater control over immigration. Thank you. Thank you.
The negative presentation has been presented by Prithvi Rajashekharan.
Thank you. Now, before I begin, I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone for being out here and making this event possible. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak in front of all of you today. Now, being the negation, I will be debating against the resolution, which is creation and enforcement of an immigration law within the United States ought to be a right reserved by the individual states. Now, I, in contrast, believe that the federal government and not the individual states should be the ones that are creating immigration policy. This being for three main reasons. First, the federal government has a greater scope of power, which will allow it to more effectively deal with any problems that could be presented in immigration policy. Second, the Constitution gives the federal government the power to deal with immigration policy. And finally, it is simply impractical to have a different policy for each individual state. But first, let's talk about the federal government and its scope of power. Now, I'm sure, as you all know, that the federal government is far more powerful than any individual state. And that simply makes it better equipped to deal with the issue of immigration policy because it has more options and it has more tools at its disposal. To quote Time magazine, only Congress can address the issue of immigration in all its complexity, taking on the many concerns on all sides. For instance, if you look to immigration policy, you will see that a large part of it has to do with how our nation deals with people who are entering this country illegally. Now, in regards to this, the federal government can take actions that individual states simply cannot. For instance, they can create national databases for employers to make sure that their employees are residing in this nation legally. In addition, they can take measures such as providing pathways for certain illegal immigrants to obtain legal status in this nation and possibly even citizenship. And so, as you can see, the federal government is more powerful, and that gives them more options and more tools to deal with the issue of immigration policy. So it is simply more practical for them to have this power. Second, if you look towards the Constitution, you will see that the federal government is specifically given the power to deal with immigration. Now, as my opponent mentioned, the Constitution gives the states the right to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. And according to the Supreme Court, that gives them the unchallengeable right to preside over immigration law. And this can be seen by the Supreme Court's recent holding in the case of SB 1070, the controversial Arizona immigration law. In their holding in this case, the Supreme Court stated that the federal government has the undeniable and unchallengeable power to deal with issues of immigration. And hence, from a constitutional perspective, it seems that both the our founding fathers and the justices of the Supreme Court believe that it should be, in fact, the federal government that has the power to deal with immigration. And so from a constitutional standpoint, I again believe that it is the right thing for the federal government to have this power. And lastly, it is simply impractical to have a different policy for each individual state. We have 50 states in this nation. We cannot have, according to quote Michael Olivas, an immigration expert, 50 different immigration policies, 50 different foreign policies. To do so would simply be too impractical. We need to have one uniform policy that applies to the entire nation, and that is something that only the federal government's policies can achieve. And therefore, again, in terms of practicality, it simply makes more sense for the federal government to be able to have the right to preside over this issue. And it is for these three reasons, because of the federal government's greater scope of power, because the Constitution specifically delegates this power to the federal government, and finally because it is simply too impractical to have 50 different immigration policies, that I believe that the federal government, not the individual states, should have the right to preside over immigration. Thank you.
Now our cross-examination questions.
So my first question to you is, do you believe that we as the United States should believe naturalization of the Constitution refers to the entire immigration process because the Supreme Court says so?
Yes, we should, because the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, and as I'm sure we all know, their ruling has an enormous amount of precedent, and their ruling is always taken into consideration above that of any other court.
My second question is, why do you believe it is important for the United States to have a uniform immigration policy?
It would simply be impractical, as I stated, to have 50 different immigration policies, one for each state. It would simply be too confusing and rather impractical for this to occur.
How would it be impractical?
It would be impractical because each and every state would have their own policy, and that would lead to a lot of confusion for immigrants who are trying to come into this nation.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
Each side will now have 2 minutes for rebuttal.
I proceed. So, in this final speech, I'd like to look at what my opponent said and try and explain why he's wrong. So, first of all, he brought up the idea that the federal government has more powers to deal with immigration. I'd like to counter this by noting that while the federal government may have a lot of great resources on its side, what it does not have is the fact that it is directly accountable to a single part of the country. Rather, the federal government is bound in its powers by the fact that in whatever it does, it must speak for the whole nation and make broad, sweeping demands that are not necessarily tailor-made to the states. Furthermore, it seems that in his argument, my opponent believes that whatever the Supreme Court does is infallible and cannot be challenged. However, I would just like to point out that in the past, the Supreme Court has ruled that slaves are property and don't deserve the protection of the federal government. Additionally, the Supreme Court has also ruled that Japanese internment was constitutional. So I'd like to point out here that just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't mean it's not wrong. And I argue that as a matter of fact, it is simply too broad. It is an overreach of federal power to believe that if the Constitution says the word naturalization, we should believe that naturalization means every single thing pertaining to immigration. That's a vast overreach, in my opinion, in my argument. Moreover, my opponent believes it is impractical for us to have 50 different policies for 50 different states. However, as I noted in my argument, this is actually the best possible scenario. We have 50 different states. We have 50 different needs, 50 different desires, 50 different demands. Therefore, what's really impractical is for us to believe that one set of rules from a federal government made in Washington, D.C., a place that doesn't even have international borders, it's impractical to believe that this one place can somehow apply all of its rules to every single state. The real practical solution is to let every state make its own immigration laws and tailor it to its own people so that the people truly get the best policy they deserve. Thank you.